Last winter, when the cold settled in a man's bones like an old debt come due, I had just enough wood stacked to see the week through, and just enough coffee to pretend the week would be kind. My cabin sat where the cottonwoods meet the first rise of the plains, a square of stubborn boards with a stovepipe that leaned as if the wind had argued it into agreement. Cattle grazed the south pasture long because the creek ran thin there, and every fence post had a name in my head because I'd set each one with the kind of care men give the work no one will praise them for. I cooked beans in a Dutch oven that had outlived 2 owners and 3 storms, and baked a biscuit on the lid just to put something brown and proud on the plate. Snow squeaked outside, the below-zero squeak, the kind a rancher hears and answers with another stick of wood. Before I sat to eat, the air changed inside the doorway the way it does when empty decides to be otherwise. 2 boys stood there, not so tall as my stirrups, cheeks chapped, hair rope-braided with care by someone who loved them. Twins, you could tell at once. The same eyes, the same watchfulness, but not mirror-made. One held his shoulders as if they'd learned to be a wall. The other had a half-scar along his eyebrow that made his curiosity look brave instead of reckless. Their coats were patched where careful hands had chosen cloth over regret. The fringe at their moccasins was stiff with melt and well-used dust. They didn't knock. They didn't beg. The one with the scar lifted a palm, empty, and then put his hand over his stomach, a gesture older than any language I've learned. The other boy kept his gaze on my hands, measuring not what I had, but what I meant. I set my rifle high on the wall peg, open breech where its honesty could show, and let the lid off the Dutch oven so the smell could make introductions. I tore the biscuit with my fingers into 3 pieces, mine no larger than theirs, and set the halves on earthenware I'd bought from a trader's wife who sold more patience than pots. I poured coffee and cut it with milk because coffee takes a man longer to belong to than it should a boy. They ate like real hungry eat, steady, no shoveling, no show. They didn't take seconds until my hand told them seconds were the rule here, not a favor. They held their cups with both hands the way a person holds not just heat, but the idea that heat might stay. Every so often, the watchful twin glanced at the door with the sort of habit hunger teaches. Hunger is never only for food, it's for safety you can't carry, and for a tomorrow that owes you nothing. I pointed at my chest and said my name, Elias, slow enough to make it a gift that wouldn't break on their tongues. The scar-browed boy touched his chest and said a word that clicked softly at the end. I matched it as best I could. He nodded, one corner of his mouth lifting, generous to a stranger who mangled a name made for better mouths. The seam at the watchful boy's shoulder had failed. My sewing kit lived in a tobacco tin, needle curved, thread waxed. I set it on the table, pricked my own thumb first because blood makes fair company, and stitched a small square of dead man's cloth to good leather. The boy watched my hands. His brother watched my face. When the last knot sat snug as a truth, the scarred one tapped the patch twice, solemn as a man signing for a parcel. I didn't say, "You're welcome." I lifted my palm, empty like theirs had been, and let it hover, choosing humility over explanation. I showed them where the floor stayed warm near the stove and tugged the quilt off the bed. A star pattern a widow in town had sold me when hay was dear, and she refused charity labelled as such. They settled with backs to the wall, that old soldier's habit even children learn too young. The watchful one tucked half a biscuit flat against his ribs beneath his shirt, as if teaching his body the math of survival. One now, one later, no shame in the arithmetic. The scarred one blinked just once, long, as a boy does when he tells himself he will not fall asleep before he knows where dawn intends to put him. I didn't sleep either. I sat at the table with the ledger open to last season's losses and a stub pencil idle in my fingers. The stove breathed like a steady horse. Coyotes stitched opinions into the night, and the cottonwoods gave theirs without being asked. I thought about the teacher woman who sometimes came through these parts to set up a chalkboard in the schoolroom, the railroad promised and never built. Miss Larkin had hair too grey for the vanity of youth and hands too capable to stay soft. she said once, while pouring coffee into tin cups for ranch hands and grandmothers alike. Kindness accrues interest if you let it sit overnight. I told her it was a pretty sentence for a world that eats pretty sentences, and she smiled the kind of smile that forgives a man for being late to decency. Near dawn, the boys woke before I touched a shoulder. The scarred one patted the place on his ribs where Bread had slept and nodded like a soldier, counting his men. They made signs with their fingers, 2 bent like a stream, 3 tapping a knee, communication made of motion more than voice. I can't swear I understood, but I knew enough. They were not out here by mistake. Distance had been chosen for them or by them. They were family to somebody who was far or cautious or both. I sliced 2 more biscuits, wrapped them in a clean cloth, and tied the bundle with a strand from the burlap I keep for seed. I handed it over. The watchful twin placed his palm against my chest for a breath. 1 heartbeat, not more, then touched his own chest. It wasn't a pledge. It was a record. Here we stood, alive, we 4, in a world bent on subtraction. They stepped to the threshold. I raised both hands, palms open, then let them fall. A small thing, learned long ago from a neighbor who taught me that open hands are better letters than whatever passes for law. The scarred boy glanced once at the peg where my rifle slept, then at my hands again, as if filing me correctly in some mental ledger. Not harmless, not hostile, merely awake. They went out into blue, cold, quieter than a vow. Their tracks pointed along the willow draw where a man could travel without being seen from the road. I poured fresh coffee and watched the steam argue with the window. I set another place at the table. Habit, superstition, respect, I can't say. I left it so until the sun cleared the cottonwoods and the stove sighed lower. When I finally stepped outside, the wind brought me information whether I requested it or not. Fresh pony sign, more than a dozen, not near, not far, traveling with the consideration riders give a wounded day. There were more tracks than 2 boys could make, old impressions fattened by melt and made honest by frost. I've seen lines of riders that meant trouble. This did not look like trouble choosing a shortcut. It looked like a people arranging themselves the way water does when it means to get somewhere without apology. By midday, smoke threads trailed from 3 separate places on the ridge across the creek. Place the way scouts place them when they want to say, "We are here and we see you," without setting anyone to flight. Before sunset, a figure appeared at the far edge of my lower pasture. A young man no older than my own brother was when fever took him, bareheaded, hands high, moving with the patience of someone who knows suddenness gets misread. He stopped a stone's throw from the gate and waited, not asking with words but with quiet. I stepped out, my hands empty, my chin level, my hat lifted once and set back where it belonged. He pointed with his chin, a respectful gesture, toward my door. Then he touched his chest and said a name. He made a sign, 2 fingers together, then apart, then together again. Twins. He said 2 shorter names, the kind you use near a fire, not on a hillside. I nodded once and tapped the doorway with my knuckles. The twins were safe. They were mine last night, theirs always. He smiled with his eyes only and spoke a word I had heard before among the willow camps. A thank you that meant more than gratitude for bread and warmth. He stood long enough to memorize my place, the path from gate to door, the way the cottonwoods leaned, the creek's stubborn bend, how my fence stopped short of the south spring. He left the way he came, calm as a good horse in tall grass. That night, I put another stick on the fire and sat very still. I didn't polish my rifle. I didn't move the furniture. I swept the floor because a man ought to sweep whether or not company is coming. I boiled water because coffee is a language, and I wanted to be fluent by morning. Then I slept a little, and in sleeping I told myself the truth. There is a kind of attention that approaches like weather, unavoidable when it arrives, undeniable once it passes. At dawn, hoofbeats, not a charge, not a scatter, a measured arrival, the way a seasoned hand lays a rope around a skittish colt, wide first, then gentle. I stepped to the door and saw them crest the low rise where the road gives up and the grass takes over. 400 is a number newspapers love. They would have called it warriors, as if a word could clean up the work of a lifetime. What I saw was a line of riders long enough to weigh on a man's ideas, elders upright, with staffs wrapped in cloth, women behind them on sturdy ponies, boys who had not yet grown their first stubborn mustache, men with their hair bound back and their eyes bound to the present. Lances watched the sky, not me. Bows stayed slung in the common-sense position, ready for anything except foolishness. They arranged themselves not close, not far, in a half-circle that left my door with dignity. The twins were there in the front line, one on each side of an old woman whose braids shone like frost. She did not look at them. She didn't need to. She looked at my table through my wall. I swear she did. Somehow set on reading what kindness had written there last night. The line did not move. It breathed. Then one man came forward, no headdress, no show. He carried a length of willow bark coiled like a question mark, and a strip of white cloth looped through his palm. He stopped where a person stops who knows a door should always have room to open. He lifted the cloth a little, that small white held to mourning, and let it fall. I raised both hands and let them drop. The language met in the middle, where usefulness lives. He spoke, and a younger man near him gave me the gist in broken English that didn't feel broken at all. "You gave bread," he said, touching his own ribs with the back of his knuckles, the way the boy had. "You did not close the door." He tapped his own chest. "We saw." He pointed at the coil of bark. "Willow says we bend." He touched the white cloth. "White says we talk." Behind him the line settled as a flock settles when it remembers air belongs to wings. I stepped back from my door and lifted my arm toward the table. If a man is to host something larger than himself, the only decent thing is to make room where he eats. That is how the day started. That is how 400 riders came to my gate, and not a single gun walked through it. That is how a kindness meant for 2 boys found its way into a covenant that would ask more of me than one night's biscuit and give back more than a man can carry alone. They did not enter all at once. That would have been a way to break a table. 3 came. An old man whose quiet filled the room before his body did, the young interpreter who had the sense to keep his English short, and the grandmother whose hands could quiet geese with one pat, if geese had any manners. The twins slid to the side of my door and stood there like doorposts who knew they were in the right place at last. The old man set the coiled willow on my table and unrolled it with the delicacy of someone dressing a healed wound to check the scar. Then came a square of tanned hide marked with lines and circles that were not letters and not pictures, yet told the truth if a man was willing to listen with his eyes. He smoothed one edge with the side of his palm and placed the strip of white cloth at the top like a header. He did not perform. He did not ask permission he didn't need. He made room for understanding and then waited, because waiting is how comprehension grows. The young man spoke. "This," he tapped the hide, "is where water runs." He drew a line with his finger that matched my creek's stubborn path. He tapped near the south spring and then traced a circle around it, small and careful. "We will drink here." He touched my chest with 2 fingers in a way that felt like a neighbor setting a hand on your shoulder when you lift something heavier than pride. "You drink here. Your cows drink." He pointed at my east fence with his chin so accurately I could see the sagging 3rd post in my mind. "No wire across the willow walk." He made a small shape with his hands, fingers curving into a trap, then shook his head. "No iron teeth there. Horses cut. Children cut. No." I nodded. A man learns quick when the lessons are practical and the teacher refuses flair. He continued, "If our pony eats your grass, we bring meat or work." He touched his chest. "We pay." He moved his palm to me. "If your cow breaks our cash," he mimed a lid lifted from a pit, "you pay." He lifted both hands, palms down, level. No shame, only balance. The grandmother moved the white cloth with 2 fingers and nodded toward my pegged rifle above the door, breech open as it had been the night before. She tilted her head, asking without asking. I reached up, took the rifle down, and laid it across the bed where quilts do more good than triggers. She exhaled through her nose, approval, not relief, and set a willow spoon near the square of hide. She did not give it. She placed it. If I used it well, I expected no thanks. If I used it poorly, I expected to feel watched. Between each point, they paused long enough for the line outside to breathe as one body. When the old man's finger passed over a mark on the hide exactly where my lower pasture gate sits, he looked at me long enough that my past behavior climbed onto the table between us. I spoke then, short, with less grammar than a schoolteacher wants and more honesty than a courtroom tolerates. Sometimes I close the gate too hard, I said, and made with my hands the motion of jammed hinge turned sulk. The interpreter's mouth opened in what might have been a smile, and the old man's eyes warmed a degree. Gates open slow, the young man translated, not missing the metaphor even if he wasn't sure where my grammar put it. I poured coffee into tin cups and one wooden bowl the grandmother had brought, and I splashed milk for the twins because their eyes were on the pot, and a child's eyes are to be believed before any man's claims. Mabel from the crossing arrived with a kettle wrapped in a blanket and set it on the stove, like she'd been invited years ago, and the invitation had only now found her. She poured without asking who was thirsty. She refilled without asking who was done. "You're making a treaty," she muttered near my ear, and when I started to say something about big words for plain deeds, she shushed me with the authority of a woman who has had to bake mercy into bread more than once. Outside, the line held. There's a dignity to waiting your turn when your turn is also your guard. The sheriff's nephew rode up with a rancher who believed his shadow should be deeded, and a freighter who wore his temper where the whole county could read it. They hung back when they saw the white cloth on my doorframe, because ignorance is brave in public and cautious in front of grandmothers. The nephew took off his hat and found a spot of sky to admire while he learned how not to ruin a morning. The freighter snorted the way men do when they're mad that their meanness won't be necessary. The rancher counted riders and silently miscounted as the day reminded him he wasn't the weather. We set out the terms on the hide with fingers and nods. Water at the South Spring shared by sense, not greed. No traps along the willow draw. Animals wrong, people right them. Storms come, shelter without asking first. And the last rule, spoken by the old man and translated slow, guns sleep when mouths talk. Guns sleep, I repeated and pointed to my rifle asleep on the quilt. It wasn't performance, it was housekeeping. The twins watched like boys who'd been allowed to stand within reach of a decision. They stood mirror still until the grandmother touched each on the hair with the back of her knuckles and spoke their names like instructions to the day. When we had agreed in all the ways word and gesture can agree, I did something foolish and ordinary. I reached for my ledger. My hand moved because habit is stronger than nerves. "Let me write," I said before the interpreter found an English for my impulse. I didn't write law. I wrote memory that would not be trusted to memory alone. Creek, willow, no traps, spring, shared, gates open slow, storms help first, guns sleep. I drew, poorly, the line of the creek and the arc of the pasture gate and sketched an X where the fence would stop if I were a man obedient to better ideas than his own. Then I tore a page from the back, placed it under the hide, and traced what I'd sketched so my poor lines could pretend to be more sure than they were. It is a strange thing, the feel of your own pencil making promises your body must keep. The old man set his palm down on the page, not to press, but to invite, like he was lending me steadiness. He did not sign. He pressed, then lifted. The grandmother produced a narrow beaded tie from her wrist, triangles in the colors of dry grass, creek water, and the surprising blue a winter morning makes if you've already forgiven it. She looped it through the white cloth and left the cloth on my peg by the door. Not mine to own, mine to host. We tested the covenant inside a week because arrangements worth anything have to work when the weather doesn't. A thaw came too fast, and old ice broke into knives. I nearly stepped through rotten crust at the creek mouth and learned in one cold rush that death is quicker than regret. Before I thought to panic, 2 riders from the willow line were there, a young man and a boy not much taller than the twins, laying me a pole and pulling me to shore with a grunt and a word that meant "don't die," in whichever holy language fits the day. They walked me to the stove and scolded me like cousins. I made coffee with hands that shook, and they drank without hurry, as if time is something our bodies could be smart about if they listened to their elders. We tested it the other way soon after. A pony had cut its leg on my top wire I had promised to lower where pasture meets path, but had not yet found the minutes for. I cleaned the cut with boiled water, packed it with pitch, and wrapped it with my own shirt, torn in a neat strip. When its people came, the grandmother ran one finger under the bandage, nodded, and left a haunch of elk on my table without asking if I wanted meat. That is how decent folks say "paid" when money would lie. The sheriff's nephew came by later. He squinted at the cloth on my peg, and at the spoon with beads, and at the hide laid flat on my table. "This is a church, I think," he said, surprising himself. "Without a sermon," I told him, and poured coffee. He did not touch his rifle once that hour, and went away looking as if he'd been included in something that didn't need him yet, welcomed him anyway, if he would learn to behave. Word traveled sideways, losing weight and gaining shine, the way word does when mouths run ahead of feet. Some said I'd been surrounded, which is a poet's way of saying witnessed. Some said a village bowed, which is the kind of lie folks tell when they can't imagine respect that isn't humiliating someone. The truth is simpler. A man fed 2 hungry boys. Their people brought him a map of how not to ruin each other in a place that needed no more violence than the sky already supplies. The seasons took their rounds. I learned to hang a strip of white cloth by my door on days when coffee and news belonged to neighbors, and to tie a red cloth to my fence line when a flood made the ford mean. We added things without needing to call them amendments. If the railroad came sniffing with maps that cut water in half, we would stand on the same side of common sense and bend the line the way Willow teaches. When a rancher strung wire across the old bison track east of my place, my own hand went to his post with pliers and patience, while the old man stood in the shade and debated me about how far a man's right to fence extends before it is only fear made visible. We cut that wire together, clean, and set a gate there instead, right where the grass has always remembered feet passing. The twins grew into runners who measured the valley with laughter. They came by on errands that disguised themselves as visits, moccasin lace to mend, a strap that wanted a hole, a request to borrow a skillet for a dancing of fry bread at the far encampment. They didn't call it that. I learned the word later, too late to use it right in their presence. I gave them biscuits and kept my advice few. Once they left half a biscuit on the table on purpose, a habit they called leaving a tomorrow. I have kept that practice ever since. It is a covenant with hunger and with hope. There were setbacks because a treaty that never meets trouble is only a poster. A freighter put a trap where we had not agreed, and a dog bled for it. He came to my door to defend himself, because a guilty man always hopes his neighbor will adopt the trouble. I walked him to the willow path, showed him the blood, and showed him the hide on my table, as if paper could be a proper scold. He moved his trap and his pride a mile upriver and learned silence for a month. Once, in late summer, 3 young men from the line of riders got it into their heads that a steer wearing my brand was too far on their side of the world to belong to me. They drove it easy, meaning no harm, until the old woman's braid arrived like weather, and she spoke 3 sentences, none of which I understood, and all of which were translated by the way those boys suddenly found their feet interesting. The steer came home. I sent a note in my poor hand, and a sack of flour better than my penmanship, to say sorry for being a man who sometimes puts his cattle where they should not wander. They sent back choke cherries and a bundle of sweetgrass that made my cabin smell like humility remembered. Years into it, a man from the railroad came with paper that glinted in the sun like a polished lie. He tapped a line that would have cut the spring and the willow both in two. His map looked like a bloodless war. I pointed at my hide, then at my door, then at the white cloth and the spoon. "Neighbors," I said, and he learned you can lose an argument to a piece of tanned skin and a beaded handle if those things have the weight of 2 winters on them. The line bent, trains still ran, and water still belonged to more than a timetable. I'm old now. The stovepipe stands straighter because a boy with calloused hands and my ledger-old patience rebuilt it between storms. The spoon hangs on its peg, beads cracked to dull but holding shape. The white cloth by my door goes up on feast days of no church at all. Births, good rains, calves born easy, a letter from Miss Larkin years later saying she'd married a patient man and now taught arithmetic to children who corrected her gently and often. From time to time, someone in town repeats the story wrong. 400 warriors lined up outside his cabin. I don't correct them much because they are busy letting fear dress as admiration. When I do speak, I say it this way. 400 people stood where they could see a door and a man and a table. They stood not to threaten, but to witness. They came because 2 boys ate bread at my fire, and because their grandmother remembered all the winters and all the doors that had been closed and thought, not this one, not this time. We made a covenant about water and fences and storms and the sleeping of guns. We broke it here and there and then mended it the way you mend a good coat, patch on patch, stitch on stitch, not to hide the wear but to honor it. If there's any glory in it, it belongs to a spoon on a nail and a piece of hide that taught me where to set a gate. If you still want a lesson, take this one I learned too late, but not so late it can't help someone. A kindness given in winter is not small. It is a bridge laid plank by plank, and in the morning it can carry a people, and you with them, from suspicion to sense. You won't know you're building it while you butter a biscuit and thread a needle and lay your rifle where quilts soften it, but you are. And if one day your yard is full of riders and you are not afraid, it will be because the night before 2 boys were not either, and because you chose to be a man a door could be proud of.